This plus 350 others, around 500 people involved in the entire process. And you can see the pictures of us three co-chairs, Sandra Diaz, Eduardo Brondisio, and myself. And not to forget Hien Go, who will also manage tomorrow a session on IPES. She was a TSU leader, and she was the heart of the entire process, maybe even the heart of IPES. That's my personal take on it. We made some statements which went out to the press. Besides the 1 million species, we said that we had 75% of land area is significantly altered. We had 2/3 of ocean area experienced increasing cumulative impacts, and more than 85% of wetlands have been lost in history. These are some of the statements here. We looked into what we call in IPES NCPs, I would say also known as services, or whatever I would like to say, nature's gift. There are very different conceptions. And we had long discussions for the SPM in the annual plenary in May in Paris, which ones to use. So we used NCPs, but all the other ones are also useful in the context. When I present these results in Europe, for example, I normally use services as a term because it's much more established than NCPs. So many of them, you can see on the graph here, most of them have a downward trend, only very few have a positive one, parts of the energy, food and feed, and materials. But most of them are, let's say, more or less in a negative development in the last 50 years on the global scale. At a species extinction, there are more species and animals threatened with extinction now than at any other time in human history. The 1 million species had long discussion. If you're interested in detail, I can come to you later. You can ask me how we calculated the 1 million, but there are two ways to calculate. And it's a conservative estimate we made from our point of view. 1 million was conservative, assuming we have 8 million species, of course, on the globe, which is also a matter of debate. And you can see across different species group how the percentage threatened looks like in different groups, going from something like 10% up to 40%. So in total, for the well-known groups, is around 25% of species which we regard as threatened. And that's why I said, in the long term, in the next decades, they're threatened by extinction if we don't change the way we deal with nature. So the rate is at least tens to hundreds of times higher than it has been averaged over the last 10 million years, is one of the baseline statements here. Extinction rates, just some examples here of some animal groups since 1500, you can see. At the bottom is the natural extinction rate, this grayish part on the bottom. So extinction always takes place, but at a much lower rate than we have nowadays due to man's interventions. You can see amphibians heavily affected, but also many other groups where we have good knowledge and good data. Drivers of change, so we had a chapter on drivers, of course, and we made an analysis, which was partly a meta-analysis done in the assessment, which is exceptional. Normally, we just compile information. And we looked at direct drivers on this different, let's say, biomes, terrestrial, freshwater, marine. And the main driver so far in the last, let's say, 50 years was land use change, followed by direct exploitation, then by climate change, then by pollution and invasive alien species. Of course, this is going to change in the future. Climate change surely will catch up and take a leading role sooner or later. That's similar for terrestrial and freshwater and marine systems with slight deviations. But what's more important, of course, look at the indirect drivers of change, so social values and all these implications they have on the direct drivers. So we come to the solutions space in a little moment. That's, let's say, convergence, I would say, as you mentioned before, convergence of options for the future. It's always the same in different assessments, which I find quite interesting. We did a lot of work on ILK, indigenous local knowledge. So Eduardo Brondisio, one of our co-chairs, is an anthropologist, and he took very much care of this to have it really embedded in the entire assessment. And I just want to highlight two examples where it plays a quite important role, creating new ecosystems with cultural landscapes, which are very, let's say, widespread in Europe, but also in Asia, Southeast Asia, rice terraces, etc. And also developing production systems with a multitude of domestic and wild species, so new ecosystems. One of the elements where ILK plays a quite important role among many others. And important contributions of ILK, or indigenous local people, they own around 25% of the global land, 35% of the highly conserved ecosystems, and 35% of protected areas are run or managed by indigenous people. It's the large agrobiodiversity in the systems, and nature is declining, but less rapidly. And yet 72% of local indicators show decline also in these ILK areas. And they're increasingly under pressure. We looked at the state of development in regard to different targets. So the IG targets are biodiversity targets. And we looked at where we are at the moment. And you can see here, for most of the targets, we are quite poor or moderate. We are quite good, for example, in things like strategies and action plans. So we're good in planning, we have good ideas, but we might not be so, let's say, efficient in implementing this. The same for the SDGs. We did some work on SDGs. No, this guy doesn't want me anymore. But focusing on those with a, let's say, closer relation to nature. Of course, you have life on land, which is the core SDG here for your convention. And if you look at these ones, all the ones where it's linked to nature, there was no targets that were scored as good or positive status and trends up to now for those which we analyzed in the connection to nature. So it's all kind of, let's say, not very positive. There's some partial support for some of them, and each of these symbols represents one of the targets within these SDGs which are linked to nature. So possible futures, we had different chapters. One was plausible futures, the other one was, let's say, target-seeking futures. We looked at different scenarios. And maybe the battery is over, I don't know. We used 3 of them: economic optimism, regional competition, and global sustainability, very briefly. And we looked at how these different scenarios work out on a global scale, looking into species richness, that's the left one. Then the orange one is on material NCPs, so that's food, for example. And regulating ones is the green one. And in all of the scenarios, we have a loss of species richness, which means this is, for example, assuming biomass production for climate mitigation, etc. There is no way where we can avoid loss of biodiversity unless you move into more, let's say, transformative changes in the future. So this is still without transformation. It's what we have at the moment, state of the art, also used in the land degradation, in the land and climate assessment by some of our colleagues. So we look at plausible scenarios which include transformative change, which are compatible with 2030 sustainability objectives and the 2050 vision for biodiversity. And well, here comes the same again as you heard before. It's about changes in production and consumption of energy and food, low to moderate population growth, nature-friendly and socially fair climate adaptation and mitigation. So we focus quite a bit on this trade-off things between climate adaptation, mitigation, and conservation of biodiversity, in general land use. So this was not too quick. Looking at the options for the future we want, we say confronting the challenge of meeting international societal environmental goals for the next decades needs a transformation, and key components of transformation, which is highlighted here. One related to climate change, deterioration, and achieving a good quality of life for all are interconnected. That's very clear, but has to be highlighted, especially if you talk to politicians quite a lot, because a lot of them work in their, let's say, silos and their segregations, their ministries. So definitely need to be addressed synergistically from local to global levels, so all across the different levels. We need a rapid implementation of existing instruments and bold decisions for transformative change. The knowledge and tools are available. They simply need better deployment and implementation. So meeting global societal goals through urgent concerted efforts addressing direct drivers of change. I've shown this before. Is this one? In the end goes up to the indirect ones. So we have to look at the root causes, and if I want to summarize this from our co-chair's point of view, it looks like this is about governance, about economic systems, about equity, about cross-sectoral planning, which was mentioned here today as well, incentives, and the social narrative and values. So what is our narrative? What are we going for? Is it GDP or is it human well-being, for example? This is really strange here. Some examples for the cross-sectoral integrated management at multiple levels. We had some of them today. Food production, conservation goals, so complementary and interdependent. We have to think both in the same directions. In fisheries, integrated management on land, in freshwater and oceans. There's not so much your land degradation topic. Then land-based climate change mitigation, as I said before, attention to trade-offs, biodiversity, climate mitigation, land use. And nature-based solutions in cities, crucial for global sustainability. These are 4 of these cross-sectoral elements we highlighted in our assessment. Recognizing that ILK knowledge, and enhancing the quality of life as well as nature conservation, sustainable use, relevant to broader society. So integrating local communities is also a core aspect, having them as partners on board, which I think we managed quite nicely now in the global assessment of IPBES. A key constituent of sustainable pathways is the evolution of global financial economic systems to build a global sustainable economy. So one that steers away from the current limited paradigm of economic growth. That's a statement which we have in our summary for policymakers, which made it through the plenary discussions in Paris, which was a bit surprising for me, but in the end, all the governments agreed to this one, including the United States, India, China, name it, Brazil, even Brazil. And there are many societal responses and successful examples for rapid transformative change, which are already happening in many sectors, just not at the scale needed to match that of the crisis. So bold actions and commitment from local to global levels are urgently needed. So that's more a kind of, as I said, policy statements rather than the scientific detailed evidence, but it's derived from the analysis we did as a joint activity of natural, social science, policy people, and stakeholders. It's a big mix of people involved here. So in a nutshell, we also say it's the most comprehensive global picture of the links between nature and people in recent times ever produced. Trends worrying and clearly unsustainable, and the call for action, prompt action, go further and faster, tackling the root causes of nature's deterioration, and coordinated and integrated across sectors and scales. It's a very important component. One example, we were invited by Macron and the LSA on the very day of the press release of the SPM. In the meantime, we had many different meetings on very different levels with politicians, but also many activities and let's say, interactions on very local scales, which then, of course, take place in the local language. So I'm from Germany. We have lots of activities in German language on the local scale, but also go up to the government scale, so it's in both directions. And I feel that, well, it was quite impressive, the response we got from the press, of course. Some examples here of this global assessment. It was amazing. So far, we have 30,000 events of something in the press on the global assessment across the globe in around 50 languages, 150 countries. Okay, and I'm through, except this last slide. For tomorrow, 13:10 in room Med 6, the IPBES assessment, Science for Decision Making. You're all invited to join us there for our presentations. Thank you very much.
So the stage has been set for the next major report that came out only at the first week of August. We have two of the coordinating lead authors here, and the first one is Fatima Denton. She had the daunting task, if you've ever seen the full title of the report, of scoping and pulling together a lot of elements that relate fundamentally to the interconnections between climate and land. And with that, I introduce Fatima Denton. Please join us. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Baron. So I was somehow reflecting about the land and climate report, especially since we were in Geneva not so long ago at the approval session, and thinking about why we were all very charged and quite excited about the report. And I think when we talk about energy systems, in a way, this is about systems, and energy and carbon is like the currency of development. But land is different. We're all quite emotional about land because we all identify with it. It's about people, it's about survival, it's about identity, it's about civilization. So there's something that really, is very profound about how we all relate to land. So a lot of this you would have heard already, but just thought I'll throw some of the headline statements. We know that there are multiple demands on land, and I'm sure Jim and others would have made this point this morning, and the demands are many because it's water, it's energy, it's well-being in general, but we also know that the human pressure on land is increasing. Pressure from the way we use land, the way we use nutrients, the way the intensive consumption of food, agricultural production, and some of the food that we eat, which is sort of high emission sort of food. So all of that we're seeing more and more pressure than land can actually cope with. We also know that land is part of the solution. And I think the irony is that we've spent a lot of time talking about energy as the main culprit and energy as the solution, energy systems in other words, hydrocarbons and all of that. But we do know that land is part of the solution. But we also know that as much as it is part of the solution, land cannot do it all. We have to look at other options. I've mentioned this already, so no need to go into details. Just to sort of maybe focus a little bit more on the food system, the land-food system sort of interaction. Obviously, we can see that there is warming, and it's occurring, as I said, faster than the global average, 1.5 degrees, and this is between 2006 and 2015. We are drawing on land resources faster than we can renew, faster than we can replenish, and faster than we can restore. And these are all problems, challenges for us. We also know that climate change is obviously going to add to the problem. It's going to make life more difficult. And obviously we know that if we start taking urgent action, that this might act as a buffer, especially in terms of the way we've been sort of over-exploiting and drawing on land resources. We see that there are three categories of pressure. There's pressure, as I mentioned, in terms of agricultural production. There's pressure in terms of food demand, and there's pressure in terms of the rate of the depletion of land, desertification and degradation, basically. In terms of land and climate interaction, the way we use land, as I mentioned before, has implications for the climate system. So there are complex interactions between land and climate. And land and climate basically interact in several different ways across spatial and temporal scales. So land is also important in the sense that it plays an important role in regulating the climate system. So land as the regulator of climate system, I think that's also one interaction that we see. The other one is more or less in terms of, or an extension of that point, is the altering role. In other words, terrestrial ecosystems and land use are affected by a changing climate. And we also know that the more we degrade land, the more we deplete nutrients and soils, the more this will affect the ecosystem functioning and the capacity of land to act either as a source or a sink. Climate change would also affect the distribution patterns of land cover. It would alter species composition and diversity, as well as alter vegetation structure and productivity. And obviously, we know that with all of this, we're looking at ecosystem loss and food system upheaval in a way, because it's a disruptive process. And that disruption will be felt in terms of land productivity, the pressure that we're putting on land, and potentially the management solutions that we can come up with as well, I think would all be more or less affected. So the feedback loops, or feedback to the climate system, we know the changes in conditions from human use would also affect, in turn affect regional and global climate. And we will be talking a little bit about that, I think, in terms of some of the regions that are going to feel the implications of land degradation and overexploitation of some of the resources that we've mentioned. We also know that changes in land conditions would modulate likelihood, intensity, and duration of many extreme events. And we're seeing many of these extreme events occur. Regional climate change also, we know, can be either dampened or enhanced by changes in land cover and land use. I thought it best perhaps to use the D word to basically just give a few messages. The one already we've talked about, the D for degradation and depletion. Obviously, we're seeing more and more increased deforestation, and that deforestation also has an impact in terms of yield decline, but also in terms of just the nutritional security of vulnerable groups. The more land is degraded, the more people that rely on land are not able to have food, the food that they rely on. And of course, we know that land degradation would affect all the 4 pillars of food security. We also know that with land degradation also comes the devaluation and depreciation of land. The capacity, the productivity of land is depreciated quite a lot. And especially for people who are in dry lands are going to feel this even more. There's a D also for diminution, because we're seeing some regions of the world, especially in Africa, where they're feeling the yield gap, especially in hotspots like the Sahel, for instance. This yield gap has been especially felt. And this has implications for the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of the poverty goal, or even goals related to access to water and even access to energy. And again, as I said, the distribution of impact, D for distribution of impact, will be felt by regions that are already very much affected. And again, I mentioned the Horn of Africa and the Sahel especially are going to be severely impacted, because these are regions that are already feeling the impacts of land degradation. And it's not just the biophysical manifestation of these impacts, but there is also the fact that social vulnerability is a problem. If you look at the Sahel, for instance, there is a stronger likelihood of people in the Sahel to move towards migration as a way of coping with some of the hardships that are caused by land degradation. So climate-induced migration is becoming even more. And of course, as this happens, it's also going to drive people towards the edge and going to make life more difficult, especially in terms of extreme poverty. And I think this is even more serious, because we already had the IPCC 1.5 report that tells us that at 2 degrees Celsius, Southern Africa will experience 40-day-long heat waves. I mean, these are some things that we know already. So I think we shouldn't forget what the findings of the 1.5 report was all about. And the findings of the Land and Climate report is more or less going to add to what we already know. So the warm extremes will double at 1.5. We also know that the average drought length is increasing by 4 months, and that we know that this increase, again, is going to be felt in some of the hot spots. We also know that a global average temperature that increases to 2 degrees Celsius will translate to up to 4 degrees Celsius for South Africa, but also in other parts of Africa as well. And we know that whilst there is a lot of evidence of community adaptation, we know that this is nowhere enough, and there are limits to the community adaptation, because most of the vulnerable groups are basically coping with degradation of different sorts and do not often have the requisite knowledge to meet with some of these problems. In terms of diversification of responses, the report talks a lot about SLM, but one of the questions that we've asked ourselves is, if SLM is so important, why is it that the uptake of SLM hasn't been as big as one would have expected it? Why is it that countries are not sort of waving the SLM banner and basically saying that here is a tried and tested solution, and why is it not taken as seriously as one would expect? So SLM is important, but it's obviously not the only option. We know that if you do SLM properly, you are able to buffer against pressures, and the pressures on climate change, but as well as pressures on ecosystem and society. Other options like forest management, I think, would be important. important for the maintenance of land productivity, but also important in terms of potentially reversing the impacts of land degradation. We've seen also that deforestation is a problem, and the way in which we can reduce deforestation would also have an impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So deforestation would be fundamentally important. The whole aspect of food loss, a lot of waste, and in a way there is a certain sense of asymmetry, because in the South you see a lot of food loss, but the food loss that you see in the South is mainly because people do not have the relevant infrastructure that would help them cope or be able to convert food or conserve food properly. So in the West, a little bit of waste across the value chain. In the South, because the relevant infrastructure is absent. Decentralized governance and decision-making is going to be hugely important. Indigenous knowledge is important, but obviously this knowledge is also fast disappearing. Knowledge has its own limits, and we have to